The journey of spiritual formation is a journey of change, of transformation through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So let's grow some deep roots of faith and join together for the next 40 days of soul-searching, transforming, life-giving work, responding to God's call and exploring our life of faith.
My name is Paula Becker, and I'm a disciple at Prince of Peace Church. We're here today to talk about empty to fulfilled. In our society today, we have a lot of people who feel a deep emptiness within themselves. We don't really know where all of that comes from, but we do know that oftentimes when we feel separated from the people around us, from ourselves and from God, this feeling of emptiness is what we end up with. It's not unlike people in our culture right now to not find time to connect and to spend the energy and the effort that it takes to make a relationship in which they feel heard and understood and loved and cared for. So there's a lot of vacancy in the relationships that we have with other people. It's also true that not often do people take time to look inside, to spend time just to listen to their own heart and hear the murmurings of that to help tell us who we are and what's important for us. And when we don't hear that, it's often even more difficult to hear the soft whispering voice of God meet us within to help lead and guide our life. And so that sense of emptiness can really be pervasive. Today in our story, Jesus is really clear about the importance of relationship as he starts this relationship with the Samaritan woman. He does that without pretense. He does that without demands. He comes to her and he simply says, "Can I have water?" But in doing that, it breaks all of the boundaries that had been set up culturally and religiously between them. He chooses to simply ask a question which by its very nature sees her as a human being instead of as someone who is different than he is. This is an important step to what Jesus was trying to do right at the very beginning of this story. But the woman has her own sense about all of those rules, and she responds with a rebuke. She says, "What are you doing? I'm a Samaritan. You're a Jew. You can't do this." Jesus ignores her, and he goes right to his message, and he says to her, "If you knew who I was, you would be asking me for water, and I would be giving you living water." Again, this kind of takes her back, and she responds with a little bit of a chide, and she kind of says, "Well, you don't even have a bucket. How would you do this? And by the way, who do you think you are, that you're better than Jacob, who dug this well?" Again, Jesus doesn't go there with her. He goes the direction that he intends, and he says, "I want to talk to you about water that will quench your thirst forever, about the gushing spring within that fills you up and leads to eternal life. I want you to understand this." And Jesus is like knocking on her heart saying, "This is really important. You need this. You want this. And I want this for you." But the Samaritan woman doesn't have a point of reference to really understand that. And she says, "Yeah, well, I wouldn't like to have to come back here." But that's not really what Jesus is talking about. Of course, she is taking it literally. So Jesus takes a turn at this point and goes off in a different direction. And he asks her about her husband. And this is a weird thing for her to have to deal with because, as we know, her past has been sketchy. She has a history. And she's probably uncomfortable with what Jesus has asked her. And it's not surprising that that would be so. She's had several husbands, many husbands, and the man she's living with now she's not married to. She probably felt embarrassed and afraid maybe of how he would think of her. At any rate, Jesus doesn't stop with that. He says, I know, and let me tell you more. So he breaks it open and starts to talk to her about her life and about what it has been. And this is no doubt startling to her. But Jesus isn't doing this to condemn her or to look down on her or to make her feel shame. That's not who Jesus is, and it is not what he does. What he was doing was opening her to the grace that he was offering in his presence. And she did get that, and we do see that later, that this was an experience for her that was freeing. So she recognizes that Jesus is a prophet, and she says that. And then she asks a question. It's a yes or no, right or wrong question about worship. Well, Jesus wasn't going to go there. He wasn't going to deal with it that way. He brought it back to her and said, what's important is not the rules of the past. What's important now is that you come to God as you are, in simplicity and honesty, and you let your spirit soar. Well, I'm sure the woman didn't really understand what Jesus was saying, and so she said, you know what? I'm going to wait for the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, then we'll know. Then we'll get all these things answered. And Jesus looks at her and he says, I am the Messiah. I'm the one you are waiting for. You don't need to look any further. This was an amazing opening for her. And at that point, she left. But what we learn about is that she went back to her village and she told people, I have met a man who knows me inside and out. Now, we don't say that unless we really feel like that's a good thing. She says, I think he might be the Messiah. What do you think? You should go meet him. She wanted people to know this man because of the experience that she had of being known inside and out. All the way through this text, Jesus is teaching us. He began with the very first part of the way he was connecting to this Samaritan woman. He started off with a way of saying, be non-judgmental in your approach to people who are different from you. Let yourself be authentic. Give yourself the opportunity to see that person as a human being. Don't let rules and regulations get in your way. All of these things were things that Jesus was doing in this one little statement that he made to her in asking for a drink. But this is also a lesson for us. This is an important lesson for us, especially in this day and age where we have so many divisions and so many people fearful of others, that we learn how to be authentic, how to open our hearts, how to be present with someone in a way that is not judgmental. This is an extremely important part of what Jesus was trying to teach us in this lesson in a very subtle way, but in a very powerful way. The disciples saw it and were taken back by his conversation with her. And when we meet people who are different or who we have judged, this is our opportunity to really change our hearts so that we can meet them in a way that opens us and opens them to the possibility of relationship, so that we are likely then to have relationships with people that we couldn't imagine that in time before that we would do that we could meet them and care about them and they could come to know us and care about us, that we create the possibility for that to happen. And that is so important in our life today. Another one of the profound learnings of this message for me is when Jesus talks to her about her husband and about her life. the profound part about that is that she was able to stay with that she didn't pull back, that she didn't turn away or run away. One of the things I think about with this is that what it would be like for me if Jesus came to my home and knocked on the door and came in and said, "I'd like to tell you about your life." And how would I respond to that? When I even think about it, my first response is a little bit of trepidation. Like, ooh, I'm not sure I'd like that too well. That would be a little difficult. And I realize that that comes from that inner fear that people have, that if we're known, if we're really known at our core, that we won't be loved. And so we tend to hide and cover up and try to make right the things that are within us that we are afraid of and that we feel bad about. And so what this message was for Jesus is he said, no, you can't have grace if you're pretending that there's nothing to have grace for. You can't accept what is given if you're afraid that who you are as you are isn't good enough to accept it. So Jesus' message to her and his message to us is the same. We have to be broken open. We have to allow ourselves to be fully free of what we have hidden. We're so used to pounding things deeply within us to keep it from being known, that this gentle aspect of Jesus that comes to us and say, here's my grace. Take it. It's free. Just take it. And we tend to tense up. And yet, if we allow ourselves, if we give ourselves a breath, we can be free to let that go. And what that does for us is it gives us a chance to really experience what God does. It's like God takes our heart and opens it up and starts to brush away all of the stuff, the guilt, the fear, the shame, the sadness, the greed, all of the things that we are so ashamed of, as if it's all just brushed away. And then he closes it up and he gives it back. He says, clean bill of health. And then we put that inside of us and there's a freedom because there's nothing to hide anymore. There's nothing that we have to pretend about. There's nothing that we have to try to be so that we're good enough for it. It's already happened. We're already free of the pain. And now, this is where we can really be who we are. And this is where Jesus' answer to the woman's question about worship is so important, because what he is saying is that when we are really free with his grace, when we are free and that opens us, then what fills us is this wonderful power of the Spirit, this gushing, huge fountain of the Spirit that fills us. And that's what worship is. That when we live in that, we are truly filled.